What if the places that were supposed to represent success, safety, and arrival are now quietly collapsing from the inside? What if the most iconic urban complexes in New York were never symbols of progress, but perfectly engineered traps designed to extract time, money, and psychological stability until nothing is left? For decades, these massive residential and mixed-use complexes were sold as proof that the American urban dream was real. Live here and you made it. Work here and you belong. Walk these corridors and you're inside the future. Glass towers, luxury branding, security desks, polished lobbies, controlled access, everything carefully designed to signal stability, prestige, and permanence. But beneath that surface, something fundamental has been breaking down, slowly, methodically, and almost invisibly. The truth is uncomfortable. These complexes were never built to sustain human life in the long term. They were built to optimize density, maximize revenue, and ease, normalize pressure. What once felt like opportunity now feels like constant negotiation with stress. Elevators that don't work reliably, maintenance that lags for months, common spaces that feel sterile, watched, and emotionally empty, rents that rise faster than income, fees layered on top of fees, rules replacing trust, systems replacing people. This is not a sudden collapse. There was no explosion, no single scandal, no dramatic failure that forced headlines. That's precisely why it's dangerous. The collapse happens quietly, through accumulation, through exhaustion, through the slow realization that living here requires a permanent state of alert. You don't relax, you endure. You don't settle, you adapt. You don't live, you manage. These complexes were marketed as solutions to urban chaos. In reality, they concentrated it. Thousands of people stacked vertically, isolated horizontally, and disconnected socially. Neighbors become strangers. Silence replaces community. The city doesn't feel alive. It feels transactional. Every interaction is mediated by systems, apps, cards, codes, policies. Even basic human friction is outsourced to bureaucracy. What makes this worse is the narrative surrounding it. If you struggle, you're told it's normal. If you feel overwhelmed, you're told that's just New York energy. If you can't keep up, the implication is clear. The city isn't broken. You are. That psychological inversion is the most powerful mechanism of all. It prevents collective awareness. It keeps the collapse individualized, internalized, and invisible. And here's the turning point most people miss. These complexes are not failing despite their success. They are failing because of it. Because the model rewards constant expansion, constant pressure, constant extraction. Because human limits were never part of the equation. Because the dream was designed to look permanent while functioning as disposable. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Once you see these spaces not as homes, but as systems of containment, the rest of the story starts to make disturbing sense. The stress, the exits, the silence, the slow disappearance of normal life inside the most powerful city on Earth. Before we go any further, this is the moment where understanding why this matters becomes essential. What we're talking about here isn't just architecture or real estate or New York as an abstract idea. This is about how modern cities are quietly reshaping human life, psychologically, socially, and emotionally, without ever asking permission. And if this feels familiar, uncomfortable, or even personal, that's not accidental. If you've ever felt exhausted by city life without being able to explain why, if you've ever wondered how a place so powerful can feel so draining, then your perspective matters here. Take a moment to leave a comment and say what resonated most so far. Even a single word like pressure, trap, or illusion helps surface patterns most people keep silent about. If this analysis is helping you see the city differently, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because following this series means continuing to question narratives that were never built for your well-being. Understanding these systems is the first step to not being consumed by them. Now that the illusion has been exposed at the surface, the next step is more unsettling, because the real collapse doesn't announce itself. It hides in routines, in maintenance failures, in spaces that look functional but feel wrong. The most dangerous collapses don't arrive with sirens, headlines, or evacuations. They arrive disguised as routine. That's exactly what's happening inside many of New York's largest urban complexes right now. Nothing big seems to be wrong, and that's the trap. The lights are still on, the doors still open, people still go to work. But something essential has stopped functioning, and almost no one is willing to name it. This is a form of collapse that hides inside normality. Elevators break down, but not all at once, just often enough to become expected. Hallways feel neglected, but not abandoned enough to trigger outrage. Security feels present, yet strangely ineffective. Systems don't fail completely, they degrade. And degradation is easier to ignore than disaster. What you're witnessing is not dysfunction by accident, but by accumulation. Small delays, minor failures, constant friction. Each issue too insignificant on its own to justify alarm, yet devastating when stacked together day after day. Residents begin to adapt instead of resist. They leave earlier. They walk farther. They lower expectations. They internalize inconvenience as the cost of living somewhere important. This is how a city teaches people to tolerate decline without ever calling it decline. Inside these complexes, time becomes distorted. Simple tasks require planning. Nothing flows naturally. You wait for elevators, for maintenance, for responses, for fixes that never fully arrive, and waiting does something subtle to the human mind. It trains you to accept powerlessness. It replaces agency with patience, and patience with resignation. What's striking is how rarely this shows up in public narratives. There are no viral clips about daily friction, no breaking news about psychological erosion. The story of collapse is happening below the threshold of spectacle. It lives in size, clenched jaws, missed connections, and the constant feeling of being slightly behind life. Even worse, the design of these complexes reinforces isolation. Thousands of people share the same structure, yet rarely form community. Interactions are brief, transactional, defensive. Everyone is moving through the same broken system alone. That loneliness is not a side effect. It's part of the mechanism. Isolated people don't organize. They cope individually. And coping becomes the proof that things are fine. This is why the collapse goes unnoticed for so long, because it doesn't look like failure. It looks like adulthood, like responsibility, like paying the price of ambition. The city reframes stress as maturity and exhaustion as success. By the time people realize something is deeply wrong, they've already adjusted their lives around it. But adjustment is not resilience. It's surrender with better branding. And once this pattern sets in, the physical environment starts to speak louder. Infrastructure becomes a confession, not through catastrophe, but through repetition. The same problems, the same excuses, the same unresolved decay looping endlessly. At this point, the city isn't fixing itself anymore. It's teaching people how to live inside a permanent state of malfunction and calling it normal. If this pattern feels familiar, leave a comment with the word normalized or slow collapse. Naming it is how the illusion starts to crack. At a certain point, infrastructure stops being neutral. It stops being background. It starts telling the truth. In New York's collapsing urban complexes, the physical environment has become a quiet confession, one that residents experience daily but are taught to mentally filter out. Pipes, elevators, security systems, heating, ventilation, lighting, access controls. These aren't just technical components, they're signals, and right now, they're signaling distress. Infrastructure is supposed to be invisible when it works. You're not meant to think about it. The moment you start noticing it constantly, something has already gone wrong. In many of these complexes, systems no longer fail dramatically. They fail persistently. Elevators that stall between floors, heating that works unevenly, water pressure that fluctuates. card access that glitches just often enough to erode trust, maintenance tickets that close without resolution, repairs that feel temporary, cosmetic, rushed. What's revealing is not that these problems exist. All cities have them. It's how normalized they've become. Residents begin to anticipate failure. They change behavior preemptively. They avoid certain elevators. They budget extra time for breakdowns. They stop reporting issues because nothing happens anyway. That shift, from expectation of service to expectation of failure, is a psychological turning point. This is where infrastructure stops serving people and starts training them. Every unresolved issue communicates the same message. This system is overstretched, underinvested, and no longer designed around human comfort. And when those signals repeat daily, they reshape perception. The building doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a compromised machine you're temporarily surviving inside. There's another layer that's harder to ignore once you see it. Many of these complexes were marketed as future-proof: smart buildings, luxury living, integrated systems. In reality, that complexity makes decay harder to fix. When systems break, no one seems fully responsible. Management blames vendors. Vendors blame software. Software updates are promised. Nothing changes. Accountability dissolves into process. This creates a strange emotional environment. Residents feel watched but not protected, managed but not cared for. Cameras exist, yet incidents still happen. Rules are enforced, but services lag. The infrastructure feels strict where it should be supportive, and absent where it should be reliable. Over time, the environment itself becomes stressful, not because of any single failure, but because of constant uncertainty. Will this work today? Will that break again? Can I rely on this system when I need it most? Living inside that question drains mental energy. It keeps people slightly tense, slightly alert, slightly on edge, all the time. And here's the reframe most people miss. Failing infrastructure isn't just a budget issue. It's a structural warning. It shows where priorities have shifted. When extraction outpaces reinvestment, systems decay first. And when systems decay, quality of life follows quietly behind. This is the moment where the lie of stability begins to fracture. Because once the environment itself stops cooperating, the illusion of control collapses next, and the experience of living here shifts from inconvenience to something much heavier. If you've lived this, comment, "I noticed it," or constant friction. Recognition is how this stops, feeling personal and starts looking structural. There's a moment when people living inside these complexes realize something unsettling. They're no longer living there. They're managing survival. The shift is subtle at first. You stop inviting people over. You stop lingering in shared spaces. You stop expecting comfort from the place that's supposed to be your refuge. Home becomes a logistical node, not a sanctuary. Inside these collapsing complexes, daily life is shaped by anticipation of friction. You plan around systems instead of relying on them. You leave earlier than necessary. You return later than you want. You calculate stress the way previous generations calculated time. Even inside your own apartment, relaxation feels conditional, temporary, fragile, easily interrupted by noise, alerts, rules, or unresolved problems. What's most disturbing is how this pressure doesn't come from chaos, but from control. Badges, cameras, policies, notices, emails, automated warnings. Everything feels monitored, yet nothing feels cared for. Residents are constantly reminded of restrictions, liabilities, penalties, but rarely reassured, supported, or stabilized. The environment communicates one thing clearly: compliance matters more than well-being. This is where dignity quietly erodes. When maintenance issues pile up, when common areas feel hostile or neglected, when requests are answered with templates instead of solutions, people internalize a sense of disposability. You're not a resident, you're a unit, a line item, a variable to be optimized, and living under that logic reshapes behavior. People withdraw. They become quieter, more guarded, less expressive, not because they want to, but because the environment rewards invisibility. The psychological toll compounds. Sleep becomes lighter. Irritation becomes baseline. Small disruptions feel overwhelming because there's no margin left. The city demands constant performance, productivity, speed, resilience, but offers no recovery space in return. Even moments of rest feel temporary, borrowed, insecure. And yet, from the outside, nothing looks wrong. That's the paradox. These complexes still photograph well, they still appear orderly, they still function just enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But inside, residents are adapting to a state of chronic strain, not dramatic suffering, sustained depletion. The kind that doesn't trigger alarms, but slowly empties people out. This is why so many leave without a story. No scandal, no breaking point, just a quiet decision that something isn't worth the cost anymore. The city doesn't push them out with force, it exhausts them until leaving feels like relief. And when enough people reach that stage, something irreversible starts happening beneath the surface. Not a crash, an evacuation of human energy, of patience, of belonging. The kind of loss that doesn't show up on balance sheets, but defines whether a city is still alive or merely operating. If this feels familiar, comment survival mode or no refuge. These words surface patterns that were never meant to be spoken out loud. The most effective expulsions don't require eviction notices, court orders, or police presence. They happen quietly, over time, through pressure. That's how many of New York's collapsing urban complexes are emptying themselves. Not by force, but by design. Residents aren't pushed out. They're worn down. At first, nothing feels decisive. Rent increases arrive in increments that seem manageable on paper. New fees appear with technical language and vague justifications. Services once included become premium. Repairs take longer. Amenities quietly disappear. None of it is dramatic enough to protest. Each change is framed as normal, temporary, unavoidable. But together, they form a tightening vice. This is how a city conducts a silent purge. People begin doing mental math constantly, not just about money, but about energy. Is this worth the stress? Is the location still compensating for the cost? Is the pressure temporary, or is this the new baseline? The answers slowly shift. What once felt like ambition starts to feel like self-harm. And when that realization settles in, departure becomes inevitable, even if no one admits it out loud. What makes this process especially insidious is the absence of a villain. There's no single landlord to blame, no dramatic policy shift to point at. Just systems interacting with systems. Market logic layered onto infrastructure decay, layered onto psychological exhaustion. Each actor claims neutrality. The outcome is anything but. Long-term residents notice the change first. Familiar faces disappear. Local routines break. Small businesses close or rebrand. Cultural texture thins out. What replaces it isn't community but turnover. Shorter stays, less attachment, fewer reasons to care. The complex doesn't feel hostile. It feels temporary, even for people who've lived there for years. This is where expulsion becomes invisible. People leave without being counted, without being heard, without being acknowledged. They don't show up in displacement statistics because technically they chose to go. But choice under sustained pressure isn't freedom, it's attrition. And here's the twist most narratives avoid. The city doesn't collapse when people leave. It keeps operating. That's what makes the process sustainable. New tenants arrive, often wealthier, often transient, often less invested in explaining what's wrong. The system resets without ever correcting itself. The damage accumulates, but responsibility dissolves. Over time, the population changes not by growth, but by filtration. Those who can absorb stress remain. Those who can't, vanish. What's left is a city optimized for endurance, not life. Efficiency, not belonging. Survival, not stability. This is how urban decay hides behind success metrics. Buildings stay occupied. Numbers look strong. But the human layer, memory, continuity, care, erodes quietly. And once that layer is gone, no amount of capital can bring it back. If you've seen this happen, comment "quiet exit" or "pressure leaves no choice." These stories matter precisely because they rarely get told. What keeps this entire system alive is not functionality, it's appearance. New York's collapsing urban complexes continue to exist because they are still visually convincing. From the outside, they project success. From a distance, they perform stability. And for visitors, they deliver exactly what's promised: a compressed, curated version of the city that feels exciting, efficient, and alive. This is where tourism becomes part of the machinery. These complexes are no longer designed primarily for residents. They are optimized for spectators, for short stays, for temporary consumption, for people who experience the city in fragments: a lobby, a view, a rooftop, a photo, a memory, then leave before the pressure sets in. What feels exhilarating for 3 days becomes unbearable over 3 years. The city understands this distinction perfectly. That's why resources flow toward surfaces. Lobbies are renovated while internal systems decay. Ground floors are polished while upper levels deteriorate. Public-facing spaces receive attention because they are part of the narrative. Private suffering is not. This creates a split reality. One New York exists for cameras, marketing, and outsiders. Another exists for those trying to build a life inside it, and the two rarely intersect. Tourists see vibrancy. Residents feel friction. Visitors experience novelty. Locals endure repetition. The danger is that the tourist version becomes the official truth. When a place is constantly photographed, branded, reviewed, and ranked, it becomes difficult to challenge its image. Complaints sound exaggerated. Discomfort sounds ungrateful. Struggle sounds like personal failure. The spectacle overwhelms lived experience. And because tourism brings money, it justifies everything that follows. Inside these complexes, this logic reshapes priorities. Spaces are redesigned to impress, not to support. Noise is tolerated if it sells. Density is celebrated if it photographs well. Turnover is encouraged because attachment slows profit. Stability becomes inefficient. Residents sense this shift intuitively. You feel like you're living inside a set, a background element in someone else's story. The city performs for an audience that isn't you. And once that realization settles in, alienation deepens. What makes this phase especially corrosive is how it masks decay as success. Crowds signal vitality. Prices signal demand. Development signals progress. But none of these measure livability. None of them capture exhaustion, anxiety, or erosion of trust. They measure motion, not health. This is how collapse becomes invisible even as it accelerates. And the longer the city operates as a stage, the harder it becomes to reverse course. Because fixing systems doesn't photograph well. Repair doesn't generate buzz. Slowing down contradicts the brand. So the illusion is maintained, even as the structure underneath weakens. If you felt like your city stopped being for you and started being for display, comment, stage city, or not built for residents. Naming this shift is the first step toward seeing what comes next. Living inside a permanent illusion has a cost, and it's not financial, it's psychological. Over time, the city rewires how people think, feel, and respond to stress. In New York's collapsing urban complexes, the most serious damage isn't visible in walls or systems. It happens inside the nervous system. Residents live in a state of low-grade alert almost constantly, not fear, vigilance. You listen for noises that might signal a problem. You anticipate delays before they happen. You brace for friction before leaving the apartment. This isn't anxiety in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter and more corrosive. Sustained hyper-awareness. The mind never fully powers down. At first, this feels like adaptation. You tell yourself you're becoming sharper, tougher, more efficient, that this is what thriving in a major city requires. But over time, the body keeps score. Sleep becomes fragmented. Patience shortens. Emotional bandwidth shrinks. Small inconveniences trigger disproportionate reactions because the system is already overloaded. What's dangerous is how normalized this becomes. In these complexes, everyone looks fine. People are functioning, working, paying bills, posting photos. But internally, many are depleted. The city doesn't collapse by breaking people all at once. It drains them gradually until exhaustion feels like personality. This environment also erodes empathy. When everyone is under pressure, kindness becomes expensive. Interactions grow colder, faster, more defensive. You don't know if the person next to you is, a neighbor or a transient. You don't invest emotionally because turnover is constant. Relationships feel temporary by default. That emotional instability feeds back into stress, reinforcing isolation. There's also a deeper contradiction at play. These complexes promise safety, order, and control, but the lived experience is unpredictability. Systems fail, rules change, costs rise. The gap between promise and reality creates cognitive dissonance. To cope, people rationalize. They downplay discomfort. They tell themselves it's temporary, that others have it worse, that this is just how it is. That rationalization is the final stage of normalization. Once people stop expecting relief, they stop demanding it. The city doesn't need to justify itself anymore. The burden shifts entirely onto the individual psyche. If you're struggling, you assume the flaw is internal. You adjust your expectations downward instead of questioning the structure upward. This is why the psychological toll is so difficult to measure. It doesn't look like crisis. It looks like endurance, like maturity, like being built for New York. But endurance without recovery isn't strength. It's erosion. And when enough people reach this state, something subtle but irreversible happens. The city loses emotional depth. It becomes efficient, impressive, and hollow. A place where people function, but don't fully feel. When the system starts to crack, it rarely accepts responsibility. Instead, it redirects blame downward. That's exactly what happens in collapsing urban environments like New York's largest complexes. As living conditions deteriorate, the narrative quietly shifts. If you're struggling, it's because you couldn't handle it. This is one of the city's most powerful defense mechanisms. The message is subtle but relentless. New York is not for everyone. If you're exhausted, you're told you lack resilience. If you're overwhelmed, you're told you're not ambitious enough. If you leave, the story becomes that you gave up, not that the environment failed you. Structural pressure is reframed as personal weakness. This narrative is everywhere, in media, in culture, in casual conversation. It turns survival into a badge of honor and suffering into proof of worth. The more the city demands, the more people are expected to absorb. Questioning that expectation is treated as failure of character, not critique of design. Inside these complexes, this logic becomes internalized. People stop sharing concerns. Complaints feel embarrassing. Admitting burnout feels like confession. Everyone performs competence while privately unraveling. The silence isn't accidental. It's socially enforced. What makes this especially dangerous is how it protects the system from scrutiny. If the problem is always individual, the structure remains untouchable. Rising costs? You should earn more. Infrastructure decay? You should be patient. Psychological strain? You should toughen up. The city never has to change. People do. This blame inversion also fractures solidarity. When residents believe struggle is personal, they don't see patterns. They don't organize. They don't connect their experience to others. Isolation deepens. Each person negotiates collapse alone, convinced their discomfort is unique. Over time, the city selects for those who can endure the most dysfunction with the least complaint. That isn't strength. It's filtration. Those who leave aren't weak. They're responding to signals. Those who stay often do so at a cost they won't fully recognize until much later. And here's the quiet irony. The city celebrates those who survive it, while hollowing itself out emotionally. Pride replaces well-being. Endurance replaces joy. The narrative of toughness becomes a substitute for livability. This is how decline sustains itself without resistance. By turning structural failure into a personal test and convincing people they're alone in failing. One of the clearest signs that something has gone deeply wrong is not visible damage, it's disappearance. In New York's collapsing urban complexes, what's vanishing isn't buildings or activity, but ordinary life. The middle layer. The everyday rhythms that make a city feel human. These complexes are no longer designed for people who want a stable, livable routine. They favor two extremes, those insulated by wealth and those willing to sacrifice everything else to stay. Everyone in between slowly fades out. Teachers, nurses, service workers, creatives, young families, the people who once gave these explained spaces texture and continuity, quietly exit. The result is a city that looks full but feels thin. Inside these environments, time stops behaving normally. People are either rushing or recovering. There's no neutral zone, no casual presence, no lingering. Common areas feel transient, like waiting rooms rather than places of connection. You're always passing through, never settling in. This disappearance of normal life doesn't trigger alarms because it's not dramatic. It doesn't show up as crisis. It shows up as absence, fewer conversations, fewer familiar faces, fewer reasons to care about the space beyond your own unit. The city becomes efficient but emotionally hollow. What replaces community is logistics. Delivery replaces interaction. Apps replace neighbors. Notifications replace conversations. The complex still functions, but the social fabric thins to the point where it no longer supports anyone. Loneliness becomes ambient, present even when surrounded by people. This shift also changes how responsibility is perceived. When life feels temporary, investment disappears. Why protect what you won't keep? Why engage with people who won't be here next year? The city loses its future tense. Everything becomes immediate, transactional, disposable. And once that happens, decay accelerates. Not because people don't care morally, but because the environment discourages attachment. A place without attachment can be stripped indefinitely. It doesn't resist. It doesn't protest. It empties quietly. The most unsettling part is how normalized this feels. Many residents can't articulate what's missing. They just feel it. A dull sense that the city no longer holds them. That life is happening elsewhere. That staying requires constant justification. This is the stage where the illusion of vibrancy becomes most convincing. Activity is everywhere. People are busy, money moves, but depth is gone. The city operates like a marketplace, not a home. There comes a moment in every long decline when denial becomes harder than acknowledgement. New York is approaching that moment, not because of a single disaster, but because too many fractures are now visible at once, and they're starting to align. What's different now is not that these urban complexes are collapsing. It's that the mechanisms that once hid the collapse are failing. 2. The turnover is faster. The complaints are louder. The fixes are shorter-lived. The pressure no longer resets. It accumulates. And even the most disciplined narratives are struggling to keep up with lived reality. For years, the city survived on momentum, on reputation, on the idea that discomfort was temporary and worth it. But momentum runs out when the system no longer regenerates the people inside it, when exhaustion becomes the norm, when departure feels like relief rather than loss, when staying requires justification instead of desire. This is the point where a city stops being aspirational and starts being extractive. What makes this phase dangerous is how quietly it unfolds. No collapse siren sounds. No official declaration is made. The city keeps functioning, but in a narrower way. Less forgiving, less humane, less capable of absorbing error, illness, delay, or vulnerability. Only those perfectly adapted to pressure remain comfortable. Everyone else operates on borrowed energy. The truth that's finally surfacing is this. These complexes are not failing randomly. They are revealing the end state of a model that prioritized scale over stability, image over care, efficiency over livability. The cracks were always there. What changed is that people no longer have the capacity to ignore them. And here's the question most people avoid asking, because the answer is unsettling. If the most powerful city in the world cannot sustain ordinary human life without constant strain, what does that say about the direction modern urban life is heading everywhere else? New York has always been the signal city. When something breaks here, it doesn't stay local. It previews what's coming. Not dramatically, gradually, through systems that still work, just not for people. This isn't the end of the city. It's the end of the illusion that cities like this can keep extracting without consequence. The truth didn't suddenly come out. It became impossible to keep buried. If you're still here, it probably means something in this story felt uncomfortably real. Maybe you've lived inside one of these complexes. Maybe you've felt the slow pressure of a city that looks successful, but quietly empties you out. Or maybe you simply recognize that what's happening in New York isn't an isolated case. It's a warning. If this video helped you see the urban dream through a different lens, I want to ask you for something simple, but important. First, subscribe to the channel. Not as a casual gesture, but as a conscious choice to keep questioning the stories we're sold about cities, success, and what a good life is supposed to look like. Every new video approaches this from another angle, and your subscription tells the platform that this kind of uncomfortable truth deserves to be seen. Second, if you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment so I know you were here. Right. I see the cracks now. That one sentence is more than engagement. It's a quiet statement that you're done accepting the polished version of reality without looking at the cost behind it. And of course, don't forget to leave a like. It takes you a second, but it tells the system that people care about content that doesn't just entertain, it exposes, questions, and makes you think about the world you're actually living in. Finally, don't stop here. The next video that's appearing on your screen continues this line of investigation from another perspective. If this one opened a door, the next one goes even deeper. Click it, stay with the conversation, and let's keep dismantling the illusion piece by piece.